Salams from the People's Dispatch studios in New Delhi. I'm Siddhant Ani and you're watching Daily Debrief. First up, the state of Israel's treatment of Palestinians, rights group Amnesty International said on Tuesday, is a crime against humanity and illegal under international law. I quote now from a statement released by Amnesty as it released this close to 300-page report detailing the crimes. The Israeli government is committing the crime against humanity of apartheid against Palestinians and must be held accountable, end quote. Amnesty went on to add that Israel has embraced laws and practices that, I quote again, are intended to maintain a cruel system of control over Palestinians, have left them fragmented geographically and politically, frequently impoverished, and in a constant state of fear and insecurity, end quote. Prashant is in studio with me today. Prashant, Amnesty is not the first rights group to have made these claims against the state of Israel. What do we understand from this report?
Right, Siddhant. So actually, like you said, a couple of things to set the context. Last year, we had Human Rights Watch say the same. In April 2021, we had B'Tselem say the same. More importantly, this is something Palestinian rights activists, Palestinian resistance groups have been saying for decades now. That this is, this has to be seen in the context of apartheid. This has to be seen in the context of occupation, for instance, which the Amnesty report does not specifically accuse Israel of. So that's an important thing to know. Also, Amnesty is in its own way problematic because it is often resorted to the two sides. Both sides are bad rhetoric, which often accompanies many of these issues. It has also stigmatized Palestinian resistance. All that said and done, nonetheless, the fact remains that this is a very important report because it marks, Amnesty is a big organization. It has a lot of clout internationally, so it marks a seismic shift in some senses in terms of human rights organizations viewing the Palestinian question. And like I said, it's the facts of the apartheid, the facts of why this is apartheid are pretty obvious in some senses when you're covering Palestine, when you're writing about Palestine. But nonetheless, I think some important things that really stand out. One is the fact that, in the statement that you mentioned, they make it a point to say that all the territories controlled by Israel today continue to be administered with the purpose of benefiting Jewish Israelis to the detriment of Palestinians. Key point there. Another point, of course, is that Israel's treatment of Palestinians across all areas, and we'll come to that, is pursuant to the same objective, which is to privilege Jewish Israelis in the distribution of land and resources and to minimize Palestinian resistance and presence and access to land. So these, I think, are two very important statements we need to sort of consider, we need to contemplate much more, and we need to act on, at least for organizations across the world, because they really frame the nature of how the Israeli apartheid state works. And it's important to note, of course, that this report, based on the work of Palestinian organizations, the testimonies of Palestinians, covers not only Gaza, covers not only the occupied Palestinian territories of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, but also covers Palestinians living inside Israel, who are often used by Israel to say that, hey, we are a tolerant country, we are not an apartheid state, we have Palestinian citizens. But in each of these cases, the denial of rights that the Palestinians experience is chronicled by this report, which is very important. And we're talking about all kinds of crimes that Israel has committed. We're talking about seizures of land, unlawful killings, forcible transfer, mass displacement. For all the main points that we talked about in recent times, all of them come here. The Negev Desert, the Al-Naqab Desert, for instance, where right now, that's mentioned in the report, where tens of thousands of Palestinians are not recognized by Israel. Villages are not recognized, and so they don't have access to basic infrastructure. We are talking about Gaza, which is suffering under one of the most criminal blockades of our time. By Israel and Egypt together imposing this horrible blockade on millions of Gazan citizens. We're talking about the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, where settlements are being built and approved at an alarming rate. According to the report, they say that I think about 10% of the land in Palestine is covered in the West Bank is covered by illegal settlements, right? And these all have been defined as various forms of crimes, even war crimes in some cases. There are various investigations going on. So all these are facts on the ground which have been very extensively chronicled. And I think what this report serves to do is specifically, bring all of these together, point out the collective and continuous nature of how the Israeli governments, irrespective of what political party they belong to, from the founding of Israel in 1948, there is reference, for instance, to the right of return of refugees, which Israel has denied. Many of these points are supported by international law in terms of, for instance, the right to return refugees. The Amnesty report has framed this in the context of how apartheid is defined internationally, the legal definition. Of course, the other example that we often talk about is South Africa.
Yeah.
In South Africa's apartheid regime had close ties to the Israeli regime as well, so it's important to note that. So I think this is also an important report because I think it places in context the decades-long and systematic nature of Israeli apartheid policies. And this is not just one bad government or one bad prime minister or a couple of bad ministers. This is systematically ingrained in how the Israeli government functions. And I think that is one of the most important things. Activists, of course, like I said, have been saying this for decades, but the fact that a big international organization like Amnesty coming out and saying this is important. Also important to note that Amnesty International has called for UN Security Council to impose a comprehensive arms embargo on Israel.
Right.
It has specifically said that governments which are enabling this kind of apartheid policies will be on the wrong side of history, for instance. Although this has not stopped the United States, the United Kingdom and other countries. Recently we saw there's bipartisan support in many of these countries for continuing relations with Israel, continuing military relations with Israel. Pegasus recently, big news.
Has not stopped other governments from dealing with Israel either.
Exactly. So military sales and Pegasus, a key part of Israel's diplomacy. And countries across the world continuing to whitewash this occupation by making it about diplomacy, making it about relations, whereas this kind of occupation is, I think, is a very central aspect which many countries are happy to ignore, happy to not talk about. So there's reference to the citizen state law which was passed in 2018, which again reduces the rights of Palestinians who are in Israel. So I think a very important report in that sense because it chronicles, multiple kinds of variations, the use of force, the use of law, the use of vigilantes in the form of illegal settlers. All these various kinds of oppression and attacks on Palestinians chronicled. Like I said, important point is does not talk about occupation. It does not talk about settler colonialism. Some of the issues Palestinian activists have raised, which remain very important in the context of this, this largest system as well. So, some limitations in the report, undoubtedly, because it does not, I think, chronicle the full extent and nature of Israel's crimes, but nonetheless a momentous step.
Enough there to have the same findings. The response from the Israeli state, Prashant, has been quite typical, calling it, of course, based on lies and anti-Semitic and all that. How does this make sense? For example, if we were to criticize the Taliban's policy, that doesn't make us anti the Afghan people.
Right. So we have seen in recent times the anti-Semitism claim being used left, right against anybody who's critical of Israel. And as many have pointed out, this is bad because it, in some senses, obscures actual anti-Semitism which exists and which is practiced often by the far right in many parts of the world. So it actually kind of obscures that because you are tarring critics of Israel, critics of Israel's policies with that same brush, and basically it reduces the impact of the term. But also that you increasingly get the sense that this has become a way of, we saw the Emma Watson case recently where she put up an Instagram post on solidarity and was immediately branded as anti-Semitic. I believe in the United Kingdom recently, a minister had suggested that the slogan from the river to the sea, Palestine should be free, it should be branded as anti-Semitic. So we have seen attempts to criminalize the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement as anti-Semitic in various parts of the world. So I think this has just become a way of deflecting any kind of criticism on Israel, deflecting any kind of attack on Israel's policies, and it is a very problematic shift that we are seeing much more in recent times than ever before. And I think it is something that has to be countered, very fair and square. It has to be contradicted, pointing out exactly what people are being critical of. Everyone is very clear here that this is not an attack on the Jewish religion or the Jewish people. It is an attack on the policies of the Israeli government, which has clearly maintained an occupation policy, an apartheid policy over the decades, and that is how it should be seen. So, and of course, it's not only Israel. We have seen the United States also, the US representatives also completely dismissed this report, calling it nonsense or whatever. And you'll expect many countries in the world to similarly take a stand as well. But the important thing is that I think these facts are very clear on the ground for anybody who sees it with an unbiased eye, anybody who's not viewing it even objectively. These facts are very, very clear on the ground. So that way I think these are expected attacks on Amnesty as there have been attacks on many other Palestinian activists in the past, especially in the West. But nonetheless, you can be sure that the resistance will definitely continue on this.
Thanks, Prashant, for that. An important summary of an important report there. Moving on now, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic currently raging through the United States and, of course, its jails, Leonard Peltier, an indigenous leader and political prisoner, has issued a cry for help. Peltier was a leader of the American Indian movement and participated in the 1973 occupation of Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. 2 years later, in 1975, he was framed for the shooting death of 2 FBI agents. Peltier was convicted for the deaths of the agents, but there was no physical evidence against him. And in the intervening years, a lot of facts have emerged which indicate the conviction was on erroneous grounds. For all the details on this important story on the confluence of civil liberties, the rights of indigenous people, and wrongful incarceration, Prashant spoke earlier to Zoe Alexandra.
Thank you, Zoe, so much for joining us. So maybe could you first take us through the case of Leonard Peltier himself? In fact, he's been described as the longest serving US political prisoner. So why exactly is in jail, and what were the process and procedures that accompanied his sentencing?
Well, Leonard Peltier has been in prison for over 46 years for a crime that he did not commit. In addition to all the other, injustices of the fact that, someone serving 46 years in prison should be, eligible for some clemency. He has also consistently insisted that what he was charged with, what he was convicted for, is not the truth and was not a fair verdict. Essentially, Leonard Peltier is an indigenous activist who was part of the American Indian movement, AIM. This movement was organizing in the 1970s against systemic issues faced by the Native American population in the United States, which, has long struggled with, very challenging issues of racism, discrimination, police brutality, poverty, addiction, of course, all in being linked to the systemic process of, colonization, of genocide against indigenous communities in the United States. And so AIM, emerges in this moment of the, an intensification of civil rights movements across all sectors of society. And they organized several campaigns. And one of these was the occupation of the Wounded Knee area in the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. There was a, longstanding conflict between what the communities, the indigenous people felt as a corrupt leadership by a man named Dick Wilson. And so, Leonard Peltier is part of this movement. He wasn't present during this occupation, but it was an armed occupation that lasted 71 days. And following this, there was very, very intense violence faced by the members of the organization and community members who were against this, corrupt leadership. And in this context of increased violence, there were estimates say over 60 people were killed by vigilantes supported by this corrupt leader, Dick Wilson. And in the context of this, there was, a raid by the FBI. The FBI was also reportedly supporting this anti-community leader, Dick Wilson, and his vigilantes. The FBI comes onto the reservation, and the community is worried about what's happening. At this point, Leonard Peltier is there. There's a shootout between FBI agents, between these armed vigilantes, and between the community members who have been, trying to mobilize to protect themselves against these attacks. 2 FBI agents are killed in a pretty confusing series of events. And from this day in 1975, when the shootout happened, 2 years later, Leonard Peltier was convicted. A lot of the evidence against him is very contradictory. It's based on witness testimonies that were later recanted. There's, the whole legal process was rife with, inaccuracies, a lot of, false evidence that was given. A former attorney who was working for the U.S. has actually come out and said that this conviction was faulty and that, he should be released and that this conviction should be reversed. So many things pointing to the fact that not only his conviction, but all the charges and everything, really surrounded the case have been kind of mired in false accusations and really an attempt to crush this movement.
Right, so in this context, of course, there's been a renewed push for his released recently. Activists across the world working together, collaborating on this campaign. We do know, of course, in the past, many famous people, including Nelson Mandela, have called for his release as well. But could you talk about the current context in which this campaign has been going, especially since there are concerns about his health?
For sure. I mean, there have been many campaigns demanding his release, and this current one comes just as he's diagnosed with COVID-19. And, you know, as someone who's been serving 46 years in prison, in many years in a solitary confinement, in very, very adverse conditions, with little access to sunlight, he has several comorbidities, diabetes, an aortic abdominal aneurysm. And these are things that could really put his life at risk if now that he has COVID-19, he's been sick for a while. He is a 77-year-old man. And so people are really trying to up the ante and call for his immediate release because his life really is in danger. These are not conditions that someone with these types of health conditions can weather a COVID-19 infection with. They're calling for his release. They're calling for him to be hospitalized at the very least. You know, a lot of U.S. prisons have seen horrible COVID-19 outbreaks over the past, 2 years. In the federal prison that he is being incarcerated in, the prisoner's not been given booster shots. This has proven to, lessen the impact of COVID-19. So people are really concerned for his health and for his survival.
Thank you so much, Zoe, for that update. We'll keep following the case as well.
That's all we have on the show for today. From me and the entire People's Dispatch team, thank you very much for watching. For more details on these and all of the other stories that we do, you can visit our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and do give us a follow on all the regular social media platforms for updates. We'll be back same time, same place tomorrow. Until then, stay safe. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.